Everyone in the luxury restaurant laughed at the black waitress that night, until the most feared Korean Mafia boss in Manhattan slowly stood up and changed the entire room forever. Rain hammered against the towering glass windows of Sura Palace, one of the most expensive Korean steakhouses in Manhattan, where politicians, investors, and celebrities disappeared behind velvet curtains to spend more money in one evening than most families earned in a year. Crystal chandeliers glowed above polished marble floors. Jazz drifted softly through hidden speakers. Expensive whiskey shimmered beneath warm golden lighting, while wealthy guests laughed loudly around private dining tables wrapped in black leather and gold trim. At exactly 9:15 that night, Naomi Carter stepped carefully between those tables carrying a silver tray loaded with champagne glasses that cost more than her weekly grocery budget. Her black waitress uniform was perfectly pressed despite working since 6 that morning. Dark curls tied neatly behind her head. Tired eyes hidden behind practiced professionalism. Nobody in the restaurant noticed how swollen her feet were from 14 straight hours of standing. Nobody noticed the old subway card tucked into her apron pocket. In places like Sura Palace, servers were expected to move like shadows, seen only when needed, forgotten immediately afterward. Table 12, the manager whispered sharply as Naomi passed by. "Do not make mistakes tonight. Those clients are important." Naomi nodded quietly. "Yes, sir." At the center VIP table, near the massive windows overlooking rainy Manhattan, sat a group of wealthy businessmen laughing over expensive whiskey and grilled Wagyu steak while discussing investments loud enough for half the room to hear. One man in particular dominated the conversation. Richard Bennett, real estate billionaire. Loud voice, louder ego. The kind of man who treated service workers like part of the furniture. Naomi approached carefully with the champagne, tray balanced against trembling fingers already exhausted from carrying heavy plates all evening. "Your champagne, sir." Richard barely glanced at her before reaching for a glass, while continuing his story about buying another luxury hotel downtown. Then someone beside him suddenly pushed back from the table too quickly. A chair clipped Naomi's arm. The silver tray slipped sideways. Crystal shattered across the marble floor. Champagne splashed across Richard Bennett's designer suit jacket. And for one brutal second, the entire restaurant went silent. Naomi froze in horror. Then the laughter started. Loud, immediate, cruel. One businessman slapped the table, laughing while another pulled out his phone. "Oh my God," somebody snorted. "Did you see her face?" Richard stood up furiously, staring down at the champagne soaking through his expensive jacket. "Are you serious right now?" Naomi immediately dropped to her knees beside the broken glass. "I am so sorry, sir. I am so sorry." Her hands shook while gathering crystal pieces from the marble floor. Nearby tables turned openly to watch now. Some guests smirked behind wine glasses. Others whispered to each other while pretending not to stare. Naomi felt heat burning across her face, but she kept her head lowered. Losing this job was not an option. Not with hospital bills waiting at home. Not with rent due next week. Richard scoffed loudly enough for the entire room to hear. They really hire anybody these days. More laughter exploded around the table. Naomi swallowed hard and continued picking up shattered glass with trembling fingers while champagne dripped from the edge of the overturned tray onto the marble floor. And from the darkest corner of the restaurant near the rain-covered windows, someone finally looked up. Adrian Park sat alone at a private table dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, one hand resting against a crystal whiskey glass, while the entire restaurant laughed at the woman kneeling on the floor. But unlike everyone else in the room, the Korean Mafia boss was not smiling. The laughter kept spreading across Sura Palace long after the champagne stopped dripping from the table. Naomi Carter remained kneeling on the marble floor beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, carefully gathering broken glass with shaking fingers while expensive leather shoes surrounded her. From every direction, every movement felt heavier now because she could feel the eyes on her. Wealthy strangers watching her humiliation like entertainment between bites of $1,000 steak. One businessman near the bar chuckled loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "This place really is going downhill." Another guest lifted his phone slightly, still recording. "Wait, get her face again." Naomi lowered her head further, dark curls falling near her cheeks as she reached for another piece of shattered crystal beside Richard Bennett's polished shoe. Her hands trembled from exhaustion more than fear. She had already worked 8 hours at a coffee shop in Queens before starting the dinner shift here at Sura Palace. Her back ached. Her feet burned inside worn black non-slip shoes. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was not losing this job. "Look what you did to my jacket," Richard snapped, pulling at the soaked fabric dramatically. "Do you even know how much this costs?" Naomi swallowed hard. "I am very sorry, sir. Sorry does not fix Italian wool." More laughter erupted around the table. Nearby, one of the younger servers froze beside the kitchen doors, clearly wanting to help, but too afraid to interrupt the wealthy clients. The restaurant manager stood stiffly near the bar pretending to smile, while panic flickered behind his eyes. Nobody wanted conflict with Richard Bennett. Not in a place built on rich customers and whispered reputations. Naomi continued gathering broken glass silently. Tiny reflections from the chandeliers shimmered across the crystal pieces in her hand like scattered diamonds. One sharp edge nicked her fingertip slightly, but she did not react. She simply wiped the small drop of blood quickly against her apron before anyone noticed. Or at least she thought nobody noticed. From the shadowed corner near the rain-covered windows, Adrian Park watched everything. The Korean Mafia Boss sat perfectly still at his private table while low jazz drifted through the restaurant around him. A glass of untouched whiskey rested near his hand. Black suit tailored perfectly across broad shoulders. Silver watch catching faint golden light each time he moved slightly. Most people inside Sura Palace avoided looking directly at Adrian for too long. Something about his silence felt dangerous even when he said nothing. One of Richard's friends finally leaned back in his chair laughing. Maybe she should stick to fast food instead of luxury restaurants. Honestly, another man added, smirking, I do not know why places like this even hire people who clearly cannot handle pressure. Naomi closed her eyes briefly after hearing that. Just for 1 second. Then she kept cleaning. No arguing. No defending herself. Dignity was often the only thing poor people could protect in rooms filled with wealthy strangers. Richard suddenly looked down at her again, with irritation twisting across his face. You missed a spot. He pointed deliberately toward champagne, still dripping near his shoe. If you are going to ruin somebody's night, at least clean properly. More laughter followed immediately. Naomi reached for the towel beside the overturned tray and leaned lower toward the floor. Her face burned with humiliation now. Not because of the spilled champagne. Because she could feel herself becoming smaller in the eyes of the room with every passing second. Entertainment instead of human. And still, Adrian Park did not move. He simply watched from across the restaurant while rain slid slowly down the massive windows behind him. Calm, silent, unreadable. But the longer he watched Naomi kneeling alone beneath the laughter of wealthy strangers, the colder his expression became. The humiliation should have ended after the broken glasses were cleaned. In most restaurants, wealthy customers eventually grew bored once the embarrassment passed. But inside Sura Palace that night, cruelty lingered in the air like expensive cigar smoke drifting beneath crystal chandeliers. Naomi Carter remained kneeling near Richard Bennett's table with the damp towel clenched tightly in her hands while champagne stains spread slowly across the marble floor beneath golden lighting. Around her, conversations had not resumed normally. The room had become focused now. Interested. The wealthy guests no longer watched because of the accident itself. They watched because public embarrassment had become entertainment. Richard adjusted the sleeve of his soaked designer jacket dramatically before scoffing loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. You know what the problem is with this city? He asked his friends while staring down at Naomi. People keep giving opportunities to workers who are clearly not qualified for places like this. A few businessmen laughed immediately. Someone near the bar muttered, exactly. Naomi kept her eyes lowered. Every instinct inside her wanted to disappear from the room completely. But years of working customer service had taught her something painful. Poor people rarely survive humiliation by defending themselves. They survived by enduring it quietly until powerful people lost interest. Stand up when somebody is talking to you, Richard suddenly snapped. Naomi flinched slightly before rising slowly from the floor, damp towel still in one hand. Her legs ached from kneeling on marble. Tiny crystal fragments still glittered near her shoes beneath the chandelier light. Look at me, Richard said coldly. Naomi lifted her tired eyes toward him. I said I am sorry, sir. Richard smirked faintly. That does not sound sincere. One of his friends chuckled into his whiskey glass. Maybe she should apologize on her knees again. Laughter rippled through the table once more. Naomi felt heat rising painfully into her face. Nearby, the younger servers looked visibly uncomfortable now, but nobody dared interrupt. The restaurant manager stood frozen beside the wine display, pretending not to notice the situation unraveling. At the far end of the restaurant, Adrian Park remained seated alone beside the rain-covered windows overlooking Manhattan. He had not touched his whiskey, had not looked at his phone once, had not spoken a single word since the champagne shattered. Yet the atmosphere around his table felt colder with every passing minute. One of Adrian's security men standing discreetly near the entrance glanced toward him carefully, almost waiting for instruction. None came. Adrian simply continued watching Naomi, watching the exhaustion hidden beneath her professionalism, watching her force composure back into her expression each time another businessman laughed, watching her protect her dignity in the only way she still could, through silence. Richard leaned casually against the edge of the table now, enjoying the attention from nearby guests. "Tell me something," he said. "Do you even belong in a place like this?" Naomi swallowed once before answering softly. "I work here, sir." "That was not my question." Another businessman laughed loudly. "Come on, Richard. She probably takes the subway home to a tiny apartment somewhere in Queens. Brooklyn, maybe," someone else added mockingly. "Definitely not Manhattan." More laughter followed. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the towel. Her grandmother's medical bills flashed through her mind instantly. The overdue notices sitting on the kitchen counter. The extra morning shifts she picked up at the coffee shop. The sleepless nights spent calculating rent. She could not afford pride tonight. "I am sorry for the accident," she repeated quietly. Richard smiled without kindness. "Better." The jazz music drifting through Sura Palace suddenly felt strangely loud against the silence surrounding Naomi. Rain rolled down the towering windows behind Adrian Park in silver streaks, while Manhattan glowed cold and distant below. Then, very slowly, Adrian finally placed his whiskey glass down onto the table. And for reasons nobody in the restaurant could explain yet, the entire room suddenly became nervous. The nervousness spreading through Sura Palace had nothing to do with Richard Bennett anymore. It came from the man, now rising slowly from the shadowed table near the rain-covered windows. Adrian Park stood with calm precision beneath the soft chandelier glow, adjusting the sleeve of his tailored black suit before taking a single measured step across the marble floor. The entire restaurant noticed immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A waiter carrying wine near the bar froze completely. Even Richard's smug smile faded slightly as Adrian approached through the golden light, with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to announce power, because the room already felt it. "Naomi." Carter remained standing beside the shattered tray, gripping the damp towel tightly against trembling fingers. She did not fully understand who Adrian was yet, only that something about him changed the atmosphere the moment he moved. The laughter had vanished, replaced by silence so complete that the low jazz music drifting through hidden speakers suddenly sounded distant and strange. Richard forced out a nervous chuckle while straightening his soaked jacket. "Mr. Park," he said quickly, "did not realize you were here tonight." Adrian stopped beside the table without answering immediately. Dark eyes drifted briefly toward the broken crystal still glittering across the marble floor near Naomi's shoes. Then toward Naomi herself. Exhausted posture, redness hidden around tired eyes. The tiny cut on her fingertip she thought nobody noticed. Adrian saw all of it. Richard cleared his throat awkwardly. "Unfortunate accident." Adrian finally looked at him. Calm, expressionless, somehow colder than anger. "Is that what this is?" Richard shifted uncomfortably beneath the silence that followed. Around the restaurant, wealthy guests watched with open fascination now. Everyone in Manhattan's luxury circles knew Adrian Park by reputation, even if nobody spoke about it directly. He controlled businesses, investments, private clubs, entire networks operating quietly behind expensive glass towers and whispered conversations. More importantly, Adrian almost never involved himself in public scenes, which made his presence here feel dangerous in ways nobody could explain. Richard attempted another laugh. "You know how these service workers are. Clumsy." Naomi lowered her eyes instantly after hearing that word again. "Service workers. as if human beings became smaller once they carried trays instead of stock portfolios. Adrian noticed the reaction immediately. "Interesting," he said softly. Richard blinked. "Excuse me." Adrian's gaze drifted slowly around the room. A woman dropped champagne by accident. His voice remained calm beneath the soft jazz music and falling rain outside. And somehow an entire room of successful adults decides humiliation is an appropriate response. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The silence pressing across Sura Palace now felt heavier than the earlier laughter ever did. Naomi stood frozen beside the table, heart pounding painfully inside her chest. She had spent years invisible to wealthy people. Tonight, every eye in the restaurant suddenly felt focused on her. Richard forced a tight smile. "I think everyone is being a little too sensitive." Adrian looked at him steadily for several long seconds before quietly removing his expensive suit jacket. Confusion flickered across Richard's face instantly. Across the restaurant, even the staff seemed unsure what was happening now. Adrian folded the black jacket carefully over the back of a nearby chair. Then, without hurry and without a single dramatic word, the Korean Mafia boss lowered himself to one knee beside Naomi Carter on the marble floor. Gasps spread softly across the restaurant. Naomi stared at him in complete shock as Adrian reached calmly toward the broken crystal beside her shoe and picked up one of the shattered pieces himself. The room went completely silent. Not one person laughed now. Not one glass moved. Even the rain against the towering windows seemed quieter somehow. Richard's face lost all color while Adrian continued gathering broken glass from the marble floor beside the exhausted black waitress everyone had mocked only moments earlier. And somehow that simple act felt more powerful than anything anybody in the restaurant had ever witnessed. For several endless seconds, nobody inside Sura Palace understood what they were seeing. Adrian Park remained kneeling calmly beside Naomi Carter on the polished marble floor, while crystal shards rested carefully in his hand beneath the glow of golden chandeliers. The Korean Mafia boss wore a perfectly pressed white dress shirt now that his black suit jacket rested nearby. Sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, as though helping an exhausted waitress clean broken glass in front of Manhattan's wealthiest guests was the most natural thing in the world. Naomi stared at him in complete disbelief. Her fingers still gripped the damp towel tightly, but her thoughts had frozen somewhere between humiliation and confusion. Moments earlier, the entire restaurant laughed at her. Now nobody dared even breathe too loudly. Richard Bennett shifted uncomfortably beside the table, his expensive soaked jacket suddenly looking ridiculous compared to the silence crushing the room around him. "Mr. Park," he said carefully, forcing an awkward smile, "there is no need for this." Adrian picked up another crystal fragment from the floor before answering. "You are right." His voice remained calm and quiet beneath the distant jazz music. There was never a need for any of this. Richard's expression tightened immediately. Across the restaurant, wealthy guests exchanged nervous glances over untouched wine glasses. The younger servers near the kitchen doors looked stunned. One waitress covered her mouth with shaking fingers as she watched Adrian Park kneeling beside Naomi like her dignity mattered more than every wealthy client in the building combined. Naomi finally found her voice. "Sir, you do not have to do this." Adrian looked at her for the first time since kneeling beside her. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes carried none of the mockery surrounding her all evening. "Neither did they," he replied softly. The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Richard let out a strained laugh. "Come on." Everybody was joking around. Adrian slowly stood to his full height, crystal fragments resting carefully in one hand, while rain continued sliding down the massive windows behind him. The atmosphere shifted instantly the moment he rose. Calm, controlled, dangerous in the quietest possible way. Adrian placed the broken glass onto the silver tray beside Naomi before turning toward Richard completely. "Interesting definition of humor," he said softly. Richard swallowed hard, but tried maintaining confidence. "You are making this bigger than it is." Adrian glanced briefly around the restaurant. A woman spends the night serving food to people who would not survive 1 week doing her job. His voice remained level and precise. "She makes one mistake after 14 hours on her feet." His gaze settled back on Richard. "And a room full of successful adults chooses cruelty because they think she cannot answer back." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even the rain outside seemed quieter beneath the weight of Adrian's words. Naomi stood frozen beside the overturned tray, heart pounding painfully against her chest. No one had ever defended her publicly like this before. Not a manager. Not a customer. Certainly not someone as powerful as Adrian Park. Richard forced another smile, but uncertainty had fully replaced arrogance now. I think everyone is becoming overly emotional. Adrian studied him silently for several seconds before speaking again. No, the single word cut cleanly through the restaurant. I think everyone became comfortable forgetting she is human. Somewhere near the bar, one of the businessmen slowly lowered his phone after secretly recording the entire scene. Another guest stared down into his whiskey glass, unable to meet Adrian's eyes anymore. Shame had finally entered the room where laughter once lived. Naomi lowered her gaze quickly, overwhelmed by the sudden shift around her. Her chest tightened painfully because she could feel it now. Respect. Not pity. Not charity. Respect. Adrian reached down calmly, picked up his black suit jacket from the chair beside him, then looked toward the terrified restaurant manager standing frozen near the wine display. Miss Carter will take a 15-minute break, Adrian said quietly, and somebody else can clean the floor. The manager nodded instantly. Of course, sir. Naomi blinked in surprise. Her entire body still felt tense from humiliation, but for the first time all night, she no longer felt invisible. And judging by the silence filling Sura Palace beneath the soft jazz music and rain-covered windows, nobody else in the restaurant would ever look at her the same way again. The atmosphere inside Sura Palace never fully recovered after Adrian Park knelt beside Naomi Carter on the marble floor. Even 15 minutes later, a strange silence still clung to the restaurant beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers and the soft sound of rain tapping against the towering windows overlooking Manhattan. Wealthy guests spoke more quietly now. Laughter had disappeared completely. Several businessmen avoided looking toward Adrian's table altogether, suddenly fascinated by their untouched whiskey glasses and expensive steak dinners. Shame moved differently through rich people. Quiet, careful, hidden behind polished manners and lowered eyes. Naomi stood alone near the employee hallway, trying to steady her breathing beside the coffee station. Her hands still trembled slightly, while warm water rushed over a towel beneath the sink. The humiliation from earlier remained heavy inside her chest, but something else had settled there too now. Confusion. Because no part of tonight made sense anymore. Powerful men like Adrian Park did not publicly defend waitresses. They certainly did not kneel on restaurant floors beside them, while an entire room watched in stunned silence. One of the younger servers approached carefully holding a fresh glass of water. Are you okay? Naomi gave a faint nod. I think so. The younger woman lowered her voice immediately. Nobody has ever talked to Richard Bennett like that before. Naomi looked down at the water glass in her hands. I do not think he was defending me specifically. Then why did the entire restaurant suddenly look embarrassed? Naomi had no answer for that. She glanced through the hallway opening toward the dining room, where Adrian now sat alone again near the rain-covered windows. His black suit jacket rested perfectly across broad shoulders once more. Calm posture. One hand near an untouched whiskey glass. As if he had not just shifted the entire emotional balance of the restaurant with one simple act. The younger server leaned closer. Do you know who he really is? Naomi shook her head slowly. Only rumors. Everybody is scared of him. Naomi looked back toward Adrian quietly. Strangely, fear was not what she felt when she looked at him. What unsettled her most was the absence of cruelty in his eyes earlier. She was not used to that from powerful people. Near the center dining area, Richard Bennett finally stood from his table preparing to leave. His confidence had not fully returned since Adrian publicly dismantled the room's behavior without raising his voice once. Richard adjusted his jacket stiffly, while several businessmen around him suddenly became very interested in ending the dinner early. Nobody wanted to remain associated with the scene now that the emotional tide had shifted. As Richard passed Adrian's table on the way toward the exit, he paused awkwardly. No hard feelings, he muttered with forced politeness. Adrian slowly lifted his eyes toward him. The silence stretched painfully for several seconds beneath the low jazz music drifting through the restaurant. Then Adrian spoke quietly enough that nearby tables leaned closer to hear. People reveal themselves most clearly when they think someone beneath them cannot respond. Richard's face tightened immediately. Adrian continued calmly. Tonight you revealed more about yourself than she ever did. The words landed softly. No anger. No dramatic threat. Somehow that made them impossible to escape. Richard said nothing after that. He simply turned and walked quickly toward the elevators while the rest of the restaurant pretended not to watch him leave. Naomi stood frozen near the hallway entrance listening to every word. Her chest tightened unexpectedly because she realized something painful in that moment. Adrian Park had not defended her because he pitied her. He defended her because he believed humiliation itself was ugly. The realization hit harder than kindness ever could. Adrian finally looked toward Naomi across the restaurant. Their eyes met briefly beneath the golden chandelier light and silver reflections from the rain-covered windows. No smile. No flirtation. Just quiet acknowledgement between two people suddenly aware that something important had shifted inside the room tonight. And for the first time in years, Naomi Carter felt seen by someone powerful without feeling small beside them. By 10:30 that night, the storm outside Manhattan had softened into cold silver rain sliding endlessly down the towering windows of Surrey Palace. The restaurant remained open, but the energy inside had changed completely. Earlier laughter had dissolved into cautious whispers drifting between candlelit tables and half-finished whiskey glasses. Wealthy guests now spoke more carefully around Adrian Park, as if suddenly aware that cruelty carried consequences when witnessed by the wrong person. Naomi Carter returned quietly to work after her short break because she could not afford to leave early, no matter how emotionally exhausted she felt. Rent was still due in 4 days. Her grandmother's medication still waited on the kitchen counter at home beside overdue medical notices. Humiliation did not pause bills, so she carried fresh plates through the dining room again beneath the warm chandelier light, posture composed despite the emotional ache still pressing against her chest. Yet everything felt different now. The younger servers looked at her with open sympathy instead of nervous distance. Guests who ignored her earlier suddenly thanked her when she refilled water glasses. Even the restaurant manager spoke more gently when asking her to clear tables near the private booths. Respect had quietly entered spaces where mockery lived only an hour earlier. Naomi did not know what to do with that feeling yet. Near the rain-covered windows, Adrian Park remained seated alone at his table while reviewing documents spread neatly across black marble. He looked exactly like he had earlier. Calm expression, perfect posture, expensive watch catching soft reflections from candlelight. Yet every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward Naomi almost unconsciously as she moved through the restaurant carrying trays and coffee refills with quiet professionalism. Adrian noticed details now that he had ignored before. The slight limp hidden in Naomi's walk whenever she thought nobody watched. The way she thanked kitchen staff even when exhausted. The careful precision in how she folded napkins and aligned silverware despite working a double shift. Nothing about her carried bitterness. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Most people became cruel after enough suffering. Naomi somehow became gentler. Around 11:05, one of Adrian's business associates finally approached his table cautiously. Daniel Cho had worked beside Adrian for nearly a decade and understood danger better than most men in Manhattan. Tonight, however, he looked more curious than concerned. "I have never seen you intervene like that before," Daniel admitted quietly while sitting across from him. Adrian did not look up immediately from the papers in front of him. Like what? Daniel glanced briefly toward Naomi near the service station. Publicly choosing a waitress over a billionaire investor. Adrian closed the folder calmly. "I did not choose a waitress." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. Adrian's gaze drifted toward the rain outside the towering windows. "I chose basic human decency." Daniel leaned back silently after that. Because deep down, he understood why tonight felt unusual. Adrian Park rarely acted emotionally in public. Every decision normally carried strategy behind it. Control. Calculation. But tonight felt different. More personal somehow. Naomi approached their table carefully carrying fresh tea. "Your jasmine tea, sir." Adrian looked up at her. Up close. Exhaustion had returned clearly beneath her eyes despite her composed expression. "Thank you." Naomi placed the tea carefully onto the table. "Can I get anything else for you?" Adrian studied her quietly for a moment before answering. "How long have you worked today?" Naomi blinked slightly at the unexpected question. "Since 6 this morning." Daniel looked genuinely surprised. That is over 16 hours. Naomi gave a faint, tired smile. Only 14 if the trains are running on time tonight. Adrian's expression darkened almost invisibly. 14 hours serving wealthy strangers who laughed the moment she became vulnerable. And somehow she still stood there speaking politely. Daniel glanced between them curiously before lowering his voice. You know she has more dignity than half the people in this building, right? Naomi looked startled by the comment. Adrian did not disagree. The silence that followed said enough. Outside, Manhattan glowed through falling rain while jazz drifted softly beneath crystal chandeliers. And somewhere between the luxury, exhaustion, and quiet conversations unfolding beneath golden light, Naomi Carter realized something impossible had happened tonight. For the first time in years, powerful people were speaking to her like she mattered. By 11:40, the dinner crowd inside Surrey Palace had thinned considerably. Several wealthy guests left earlier than planned after the tension surrounding Richard Bennett spread through Manhattan's elite social circles faster than anyone expected. Expensive conversations about investments and luxury properties had slowly dissolved into quieter whispers about Adrian Park and the exhausted black waitress he defended in front of an entire room. Outside the towering windows, rain continued falling steadily over Manhattan, while streams of headlights moved through the streets far below like rivers of gold beneath the storm. Naomi Carter stood near the espresso station preparing fresh coffee for one of the remaining tables, her movements slower now from exhaustion settling deeper into her bones with every passing hour. Yet despite the fatigue pressing against her shoulders, something inside her felt strangely lighter tonight. Not happy exactly, just less invisible. The younger hostess approached carefully while stacking menus near the front desk. Do you know people are calling you the girl who stopped Richard Bennett from speaking? Naomi blinked in confusion. I did not stop anything. Mr. Park did. Naomi glanced instinctively toward Adrian's table near the windows. He still sat there alone beneath the soft chandelier light, reviewing business documents, while rain traced silver lines behind him across the glass. Calm, unbothered. As if humiliating a billionaire investor without raising his voice was simply another ordinary part of his evening. The hostess lowered her voice further. I heard Richard tried calling the owner already. Naomi immediately tensed. About me? About Mr. Park. The hostess swallowed slightly. Apparently, the owner apologized to him instead. Naomi looked back toward Adrian again. She still could not fully understand the weight his presence carried inside rooms like this. People with money feared losing reputation. But tonight, even wealthy men seemed nervous around him in ways deeper than embarrassment. One of the cooks suddenly emerged from the kitchen holding a small paper bag. Naomi, he called quietly. You forgot dinner again. Naomi accepted the bag. With surprise. Thank you. Eat something before you pass out. He disappeared back into the kitchen before she could answer. Naomi looked down at the untouched sandwich inside the paper bag and realized she had not eaten since noon. Near the windows, Adrian noticed the exchange immediately. He watched her hesitate before finally taking a small bite while standing beside the service station. The image unsettled him more than he expected. 14-hour shifts, hospital bills, forgotten meals, and still she apologized politely while wealthy strangers mocked her earlier that night. Daniel Cho returned briefly to Adrian's table carrying another folder of contracts. The investor situation is contained, he said quietly. Adrian barely looked at the paperwork. His attention drifted toward Naomi again. Daniel followed his gaze knowingly. You are still thinking about her. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair. I am thinking about how easily people become cruel once they believe someone beneath them cannot fight back. Daniel nodded once. And yet she never raised her voice. Adrian's expression darkened thoughtfully. That is because people like her understand consequences better than the rest of us. Silence settled briefly between them beneath the soft jazz music drifting through Surrey Palace. Naomi laughed quietly at something one of the kitchen staff whispered nearby. And for the first time all evening Adrian heard what her real voice sounded like without exhaustion crushing it completely. Warm, intelligent, human, not invisible at all. Daniel noticed Adrian listening and gave the faintest smile. You know, he said carefully, most people in this city would have screamed back tonight. Adrian watched Naomi helping another waitress carry heavy trays despite her own exhaustion. That is what makes her different. Moments later, Naomi approached Adrian's table again, carrying fresh tea. This time her hands no longer trembled. Your tea, sir. Adrian looked up at her quietly. Have you always worked this hard? Naomi hesitated slightly before answering. Some people do not have the luxury of stopping. Adrian studied her for several silent seconds after that. Then, very softly, he asked the question nobody else in the restaurant had cared enough to ask all night. Who are you working so hard for? Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the steaming tea between them. And when she finally answered, something fragile entered her voice for the first time that evening. My grandmother. The question lingered quietly between them beneath the warm chandelier light of Sura Palace, while rain continued washing silver reflections across the towering windows overlooking Manhattan. Naomi Carter stood beside Adrian Park's table holding the empty tea tray carefully against her apron, exhaustion visible now in the slight heaviness of her posture. Yet the moment he asked who she was working so hard for, something inside her expression softened in a way Adrian had not seen before. Not weakness. Memory. My grandmother, Naomi repeated quietly. Adrian watched her lower her eyes briefly toward the steaming jasmine tea resting between them. She raised me after my mother passed away. The restaurant around them suddenly felt more distant somehow. Jazz drifted softly through hidden speakers. Wealthy guests murmured over expensive dinners. Glasses clinked beneath candlelight. But Adrian's attention remained fixed completely on the exhausted waitress standing across from him, like she had unknowingly stepped outside the invisible role the world assigned her. Is she sick? He asked calmly. Naomi nodded once. Heart condition. Her voice remained composed, but Adrian noticed the careful restraint behind it immediately. The kind people develop after carrying responsibility too long, without help. Insurance covers some of it, Naomi continued softly. Not enough. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her more carefully now. Suddenly the double shifts made sense. The exhaustion. The forgotten meals. The way she endured humiliation earlier without defending herself, because losing this job would risk more than pride. Daniel Cho remained quietly seated nearby, listening without interruption. Even he seemed affected by the calm honesty in Naomi's voice. And the morning job? Adrian asked. Naomi gave a faint, tired smile. Coffee shop. In Queens. Every day. Most days. Daniel exhaled softly under his breath. That is nearly impossible. Naomi shook her head gently. No. It is just expensive to be poor in New York. The sentence settled heavily across the table. Adrian's gaze drifted briefly toward the rain-covered skyline beyond the windows. He had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people obsessed with acquiring more wealth, more power, more influence. Yet standing here was a woman working herself into exhaustion, simply trying to keep someone she loved alive. And somehow she still carried herself with more grace than anyone in the room earlier tonight. Naomi noticed Adrian growing quiet, and immediately straightened slightly. I am sorry, she said softly. I should not be talking about personal things while working. Adrian looked back at her. Why? Naomi seemed caught off guard by the question. Because customers usually do not want to hear problems from servers. Daniel looked down briefly, almost uncomfortable with how true that sounded. Adrian remained silent for several seconds before answering. That sounds lonely. Naomi blinked slightly. Not because of the words themselves. Because nobody had ever responded that way before. Most wealthy customers either ignored service workers completely or treated them like emotional background noise. Adrian Park listened instead. The realization unsettled her more than cruelty earlier somehow. Near the kitchen hallway, one of the managers motioned for Naomi to return to another table. She nodded quickly. I should get back to work. Adrian glanced toward the nearly empty restaurant. What time do you leave tonight? Probably after midnight. Adrian's expression darkened almost invisibly. And then the subway? Naomi gave a small nod. It is cheaper. Silence settled again beneath the sound of falling rain and distant jazz music. Adrian suddenly remembered the way wealthy men laughed while she knelt on the marble floor earlier that evening. He imagined her standing alone on a late-night subway platform afterward, carrying exhaustion home through the cold city, while the people who humiliated her returned to luxury apartments without. Another thought. Something about that image felt deeply wrong to him now. Naomi adjusted the tray slightly against her side. Thank you for earlier, she said quietly before stepping back from the table. Adrian looked up at her. For what? Naomi hesitated briefly. Then she answered with painful honesty. For reminding everyone I was still a person. The words struck the table harder than anything spoken all night. Daniel looked away immediately. Adrian remained completely still beneath the chandelier light, while Naomi quietly walked back toward the dining floor, carrying empty glasses and exhaustion with equal grace. And for reasons Adrian Park could no longer ignore, watching her disappear into the golden light of the restaurant suddenly felt heavier than any business deal waiting inside the folders on his table. By midnight, Sura Palace had nearly emptied. The luxurious restaurant that earlier echoed with laughter and humiliation now rested beneath a strange calmness shaped by rain, fading jazz music, and the lingering weight of Adrian Park's quiet intervention. Candle flames flickered softly across polished marble tables, while staff members moved more slowly through the dining room, preparing for closing. Outside the towering windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath silver rain and blurred city lights stretching endlessly into the night. Naomi Carter stood near the service station organizing receipts with tired hands while fighting the exhaustion pressing behind her eyes. Her entire body ached now. 14 hours of carrying trays, smiling through disrespect, and pretending not to feel invisible had drained every remaining ounce of energy from her. Yet something still felt different tonight. The room no longer looked through her. Near the windows, Adrian Park remained seated alone, while Daniel Cho quietly reviewed final documents across the table from him. You missed 3 calls from Singapore, Daniel said carefully. Adrian barely glanced at his phone. Reschedule. Daniel studied him for a moment. You never ignore international calls. Adrian's eyes drifted toward Naomi again, almost unconsciously. She stood beneath the warm chandelier light, speaking softly. With one of the kitchen workers, while rubbing her wrist from strain, she thought nobody noticed. People spend too much time responding to urgent things, Adrian said quietly, and not enough time noticing important things. Daniel leaned back silently after that. He had known Adrian long enough to recognize when something genuinely affected him. Tonight was no longer about the restaurant incident itself. It was about what the incident revealed. Around 12:15, the final group of wealthy guests finally left the restaurant. Expensive coats disappeared through the elevator lobby, while valet attendants rushed through the rain outside preparing luxury cars. One by one, the lights inside Sura Palace dimmed slightly as the staff transitioned into closing routines. Naomi moved carefully between tables collecting untouched wine glasses and folded linen napkins. Near one booth, she paused briefly after noticing an elderly dishwasher struggling to lift a heavy tray stacked with plates. Without hesitation, she quietly took half the weight herself. I can help, she said gently. The old man smiled gratefully. You already worked enough tonight. Naomi laughed softly under her breath. Apparently not. Adrian watched the exchange from across the restaurant without saying a word. Nobody knew he noticed things like that. The small moments. The instinctive kindness people showed when nobody important was watching. In his world, generosity was usually strategic, performed publicly, attached to reputation or influence. But Naomi helped people automatically, even when exhausted beyond reason. That unsettled him deeply. A few minutes later, Naomi approached Adrian's table carrying the final tea service of the night. Your tea, sir. Adrian looked up at her. Closer now, exhaustion no longer hid behind professionalism. Faint shadows rested beneath her eyes. Tiny burn marks near one wrist from years around coffee machines and hot plates. Quiet evidence of survival most wealthy people never bothered noticing. What time do you start tomorrow? Adrian asked. Naomi blinked slightly at the question. 6:30. Daniel looked genuinely shocked again. That gives you maybe 4 hours of sleep. Naomi offered a faint smile. Only if the subway behaves tonight. Adrian's expression hardened subtly. You should not travel alone this late after shifts like this. Naomi hesitated. Most people working in this city do not have much choice. Silence settled softly between them while rain tapped against the windows behind Adrian. Then Naomi glanced toward the nearly empty dining room and straightened slightly. I should finish cleaning before closing. Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his black suit jacket calmly. Daniel watched quietly as Adrian removed a simple matte black business card and placed it carefully onto the table between them. No dramatic gesture. No pressure. Just one card resting beside untouched tea beneath warm chandelier light. Naomi looked down at it uncertainly. What is this? Adrian met her eyes steadily. If your grandmother ever needs help getting better medical care, he said quietly, call the number. Naomi froze instantly. I cannot accept charity. Adrian's expression never changed. Good. His voice remained calm and precise. Because I was offering respect. The words settled into the silence around them, while rain continued falling softly across Manhattan beyond the towering windows. And for the second time that night, Naomi Carter found herself unable to speak. The rain over Manhattan had slowed to a soft mist by the time Sura Palace officially closed for the night. Most of the chandeliers inside the luxury restaurant had dimmed, leaving only warm pools of golden light reflecting across polished marble floors and empty dining tables still carrying traces of expensive dinners and half-finished conversations. Staff members moved quietly through the restaurant finishing side work, while soft jazz continued drifting through hidden speakers like the final breath of a long, exhausting evening. Naomi Carter stood alone near the front counter carefully counting receipts with tired fingers, while Adrian Park remained seated near the windows overlooking the city. The black business card still rested untouched beside the teacup where he left it. Naomi glanced at it every few minutes without realizing she was doing it. The card itself looked simple. Matte black. Silver lettering. No unnecessary details. Yet somehow it felt heavier than any object she had held all night. Because nobody had ever offered her help without making her feel small first. You should take it, one of the older waitresses whispered quietly while passing beside her carrying folded linens. Naomi looked up quickly. What? The woman nodded subtly toward the card. People like him do not make offers twice. Naomi lowered her eyes again. I do not want anyone thinking I need saving. The older waitress gave a tired smile. Honey, there is a difference between being saved and being respected. The words lingered quietly in Naomi's chest after the woman walked away. Near the windows, Daniel Cho gathered the final business folders from Adrian's table while studying his longtime friend carefully. You realize she may never call, Daniel said softly. Adrian adjusted the cuff of his white dress shirt beneath the dim chandelier light. That is her choice. Most people would take the opportunity immediately. Adrian's gaze drifted toward Naomi again. She stood near the counter rubbing exhaustion from her wrist while pretending not to look at the card. She is not most people. Daniel leaned slightly against the table. You admire her. Adrian remained silent for several seconds before answering quietly. I respect her. Somehow the distinction sounded more meaningful than attraction ever could. Near 12:45, the restaurant manager approached Naomi holding her final cash-out envelope for the night. His entire attitude had changed compared to earlier. Softer voice. Careful eye contact. Respect replacing impatience. You handled tonight professionally, he admitted awkwardly. Naomi accepted the envelope politely. Thank you. The manager hesitated before continuing. And for what it is worth. I should have stopped the situation sooner. Naomi looked at him quietly. Earlier that apology would have meant everything. Now it mostly felt sad. Good night, sir, she answered gently. The manager lowered his eyes slightly before walking away. Adrian watched the exchange silently from across the nearly empty restaurant. Something about Naomi unsettled the emotional order he spent years building around himself. Most people in painful situations either collapsed emotionally or became bitter. Naomi somehow became more graceful instead. It made everyone around her suddenly aware of their own behavior. Around 1 a.m, the final kitchen lights switched off. Staff members gathered coats and umbrellas while preparing to leave through the employee entrance into the cold, wet Manhattan night. Naomi finally reached for the matte black business card resting beside Adrian's teacup. Her fingers paused slightly before lifting it carefully. Adrian noticed immediately, but said nothing. She studied the silver lettering for several seconds before walking slowly toward his table. Mr. Park. Adrian looked up calmly. Naomi held the card gently between 2 fingers. I still do not know why you helped me tonight. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair while soft rain traced silver lines across the windows behind him. Because nobody should become entertainment simply for making a mistake. Naomi swallowed quietly. Most people with power do not think that way. Adrian's expression darkened almost invisibly beneath the warm light. That is because most people confuse power with importance. Silence settled between them again. No tension now, just honesty. Naomi looked down at the card once more before speaking softly. My grandmother used to say respect feels different from pity because pity looks down at you. Adrian held her gaze steadily. Your grandmother sounds intelligent. For the first time all night, Naomi smiled without exhaustion, hiding it completely. Small, real, human. And somehow that simple expression affected Adrian Park more deeply than every dramatic moment earlier combined. The soft smile lingering on Naomi Carter's face disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared, as though she was unaccustomed to moments gentle enough to trust completely. Around them, Sura Palace had nearly gone dark now. Most of the chandeliers above the dining room had dimmed into warm amber pools of light, reflecting softly against polished marble floors and empty crystal glasses, waiting to be cleared before morning. The storm outside Manhattan had weakened into mist, leaving silver rain trails stretching down the massive windows overlooking the sleeping city below. Adrian Park remained seated calmly near the windows while Naomi stood beside the table, holding the matte black business card carefully between her fingers. Neither of them seemed eager to end the conversation. My grandmother would probably tell me to stop being stubborn, Naomi admitted quietly after a moment. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair. And is she usually right? Naomi gave another faint smile. Almost always. The softness in her voice changed the atmosphere around the table completely. Earlier that night, the restaurant witnessed humiliation and cruelty sharp enough to silence entire rooms. But now something quieter settled between them instead. Recognition. The kind that forms when two people unexpectedly see each other clearly beneath all the roles society assigned them. Near the employee hallway, the final dishwasher clocked out while kitchen lights shut off one section at a time. Staff members whispered goodnight to each other while gathering umbrellas and jackets for the cold walk home through Manhattan rain. Yet Naomi still remained beside Adrian's table, as though leaving too quickly would somehow break the strange calmness surrounding them. Adrian noticed her glance briefly toward the windows overlooking the city. You are thinking about whether to call, he said softly. Naomi looked down at the card again. I am thinking about what happens if I do. Adrian's expression remained calm. Your grandmother gets better care. And after that, the question lingered carefully beneath the soft jazz still drifting through hidden speakers. Adrian understood immediately what she really meant. Nothing in Naomi's life had ever come freely. Kindness from powerful people usually arrived carrying invisible expectations attached behind it. Adrian folded his hands loosely on the table before answering. After that, your grandmother gets better care. Naomi studied his face quietly, almost searching for signs of manipulation hidden beneath the calm precision of his words. She found none. Somehow that unsettled her more than pressure would have. Why? She asked again, barely above a whisper now. Why does this matter to you? Adrian looked toward the rain-covered skyline beyond the windows for several seconds before speaking. Because years ago, someone once helped my mother when she needed it. Naomi listened silently. Adrian's voice remained controlled, but something distant entered his expression now. She spent the rest of her life believing dignity should be protected whenever possible. He looked back at Naomi. Tonight, I realized how rarely people actually do that. The honesty in his voice settled softly between them. No performance. No dramatic speech. Just truth spoken quietly inside an almost empty restaurant at 1 in the morning. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Most people do not notice workers like me long enough to care. Adrian's gaze remained steady. That sounds exhausting. Naomi let out a small breath that almost became laughter. You keep saying things nobody normally says. Maybe people should speak honestly more often. Somewhere behind the bar, one of the remaining employees accidentally dropped a spoon into the sink, the metallic sound echoing briefly through the empty restaurant before silence returned again. Naomi looked down at the business card once more before carefully placing it into the pocket of her apron instead of handing it back. Adrian noticed immediately, but said nothing. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath wet streets and silver reflections, while luxury cars moved slowly through the rain below. Naomi adjusted the strap of her worn bag against her shoulder and finally took a small step backward from the table. Thank you, she said softly. Adrian studied her quietly beneath the warm chandelier light. For what? Naomi hesitated before answering. for treating me like I mattered before knowing anything useful about me. The words landed heavily in the silence surrounding them. Adrian did not respond immediately because deep down he realized something uncomfortable. She was right. Most powerful people only valued others after discovering status, influence, or usefulness attached to them. Yet somehow Naomi Carter carried dignity long before anyone in the restaurant bothered asking her name. And for the first time in years, Adrian Park found himself wondering whether success meant very little if it could not recognize humanity standing directly in front of it. 3 weeks later, Manhattan no longer carried the cold rain that soaked the city the night everything changed inside Surrey Palace. Spring sunlight now spilled across crowded sidewalks and glass skyscrapers while warm air drifted through the streets of Queens carrying the scent of coffee, traffic, and blooming trees struggling to survive between concrete buildings. Inside a small bookstore cafe called Hawthorne Books, Naomi Carter carefully arranged fresh pastries inside a display case, while soft jazz floated through the quiet morning atmosphere. Sunlight filtered across towering shelves packed with worn novels and secondhand poetry books. The cafe smelled like espresso and old paper instead of expensive whiskey and polished marble. Naomi preferred it that way. Her dark curls rested loosely against her shoulders now that she no longer rushed constantly between double shifts. Exhaustion still lived beneath her eyes sometimes, but not as heavily as before. The black business card Adrian Park gave her weeks earlier had changed more than hospital paperwork. After 2 sleepless nights debating whether to call, Naomi finally used the number. Within days, her grandmother met specialists at one of the best private cardiac centers in New York. No publicity, no hidden conditions, no contracts waiting afterward. Just quiet help delivered with the same calm dignity Adrian carried inside that restaurant. Naomi still struggled understanding why someone so powerful chose kindness without demanding ownership in return. The small bell above the bookstore entrance suddenly chimed softly. Naomi looked up automatically while wiping her hands against her apron. Then she froze completely. Adrian Park stood just inside the doorway wearing a charcoal coat over a black sweater, sunlight catching softly against the silver watch near his wrist. No security team surrounded him today. No expensive restaurant crowd. No walls of luxury separating him from ordinary life. Just Adrian standing quietly among crowded bookshelves and the smell of fresh coffee like he belonged there more than anyone expected. Several customers glanced toward him curiously before returning to their books. Naomi stared for a moment longer than she intended. Adrian noticed immediately. "You look less tired," he said calmly. Naomi let out the faintest laugh under her breath. "My grandmother would say that is because somebody finally forced me to sleep." Adrian's expression softened almost invisibly. "And how is she?" Naomi looked down briefly, emotion flickering across her face before she answered. "Better." One simple word. Yet Adrian understood instantly how much relief lived inside it. Naomi stepped from behind the counter slowly. "You really did all of that without asking for anything." Adrian glanced around the quiet bookstore cafe, filled with soft sunlight and old wood shelves. Respect should not require repayment. Naomi studied him carefully after that. Weeks earlier, she thought powerful men only noticed people useful to them. Adrian Park quietly shattered that belief without ever raising his voice again. "My grandmother asked about you," Naomi admitted softly. Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. "Should I be worried?" Naomi smiled for real this time. Warm, relaxed. No exhaustion hiding it anymore. She said any man willing to kneel beside a waitress in public probably remembers what dignity means. Silence settled gently between them while soft jazz drifted through the bookstore. Outside, New York continued moving endlessly beneath bright spring skies. Taxis rolled past crowded sidewalks. Steam rose from street vents. Ordinary people hurried through ordinary mornings without realizing how much one small act of humanity could alter another person's life forever. Adrian looked toward the bookshelves surrounding them. "This place suits you better than Surrey Palace." Naomi glanced around the cafe quietly. "People here look at me before speaking to me." Adrian nodded once, understanding exactly what she meant. For a moment, neither of them spoke again. They simply stood there surrounded by books, coffee, sunlight, and the quiet aftermath of kindness neither of them expected weeks earlier inside a luxury restaurant filled with cruelty. And somehow, that silence felt peaceful instead of empty. Because sometimes the most unbelievable thing a powerful person can do is remind someone they never deserved humiliation in the first place. And that day, somewhere between marble floors, broken glass, and a simple act of respect, two strangers reminded an entire room what human dignity was supposed to look like. If this story moved you, do not forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can discover stories where kindness still matters.